Hey, it's Brian Mertens, and I wanted to create this video for you to teach you all about how to look at forests and understand what forests are telling you. Now, if you've never encountered my work before, I'm known for being a very analytical collector of just the best techniques and strategies to help trackers and naturalists get genuinely tuned to patterns in nature so you can feel confident about getting outside and knowing what's going on in the landscape without feeling overwhelmed or confused about how to look at the natural world and ground your knowledge of the wilderness in practical awareness skills. So in this video, you are going to learn one of the most essential skills for anyone who wants to really get good at observing forest patterns in the landscape. And the reason that this is such an important skill to develop is because more than any other factor that you can look to in a landscape, the overall structure of patterns in a forest are going to give you the most information about what's happening on a big picture level. What animals are potentially living here? What's the history of this land over the last 50 or 100 years? There's all kinds of little hidden secrets written in the forest, and when you know what to look for, it brings this whole new level of clarity to what you can uncover just by using your eyes and your ears to observe what's happening around you. And, most people have never had any real training in how to look at the observable structure of a forest and then to use that information to make predictions about what happens in this place through the 4 seasons and at all times of day. So what we're going to cover here are some really simple and yet very foundational patterns that you can immediately go out and start training your eyes to notice everywhere around you. And I think you're going to be blown away. My goal is that you can come away from watching this video with a strong grasp of basic landscape analysis that will completely change the way that you look at what's happening around you every single time that you go outside. So let's dig in here, and I want to put up a picture of 2 different forests on the screen. And the question that I want you to be thinking about as we move forward here is, what is the difference between these 2 forests? Now, at first glance, that question might seem like I'm asking you to make some incredibly astute scientific analysis with Latin names and soil indicators, but that's actually not what we're going for here. We're really not looking for anything overly academic or complex. And what you really want to do instead is just be looking for very simple answers. Things like, did you notice that the first forest has a creek flowing through it? Now, that's a pretty significant difference. It's also not rocket science, right? So let's forget about, what kind of trees and plants are in these forests. Let's forget about the relative acidity of the soil, and let's instead just look at the visible patterns that we can already see quite plainly in these photos. And there's a really cool framework of 3 specific things that you can look for whenever you go into a natural location that will give you basically all of the information that you might need in order to immediately know all kinds of cool facts about the landscape with just a single glance. So the first thing that I want to talk about is something called species distribution. Now, that's a very fancy term that refers to something very simple. And remember, I said that for this video, you don't need to know anything about the different tree species. But what I would like to do, and what's actually going to be a lot more revealing, is to actually count the number of different species. So, when you look at these photos, how many different kinds of tree do you see? And if we count them up, notice how the one on the left, we really have just 1, maybe 2 species of tree, and that's about it. And almost every single tree in this photo is a coniferous tree, right? They have needles that stay on the branches all year round, and it creates this dense, dark kind of forest, which is in very direct contrast to the photo on the right. And when we count up the different species in this forest, we see at least 2, maybe 3 species of broadleaf trees and 2 distinct species of coniferous tree. We could see very plainly that the forest on the right is much more mixed up than the one on the left. And this is a really important distinction to look for. Some forests will be made up almost exclusively of just one type of tree. Some forests will be made up of 100% deciduous trees, and other forests will have a whole mixture of every different kind of tree in your bioregion. Now, this is a very basic observation that slips by the awareness of most people. And the reason that this is so important for you to notice is because depending on the makeup of a forest, you're going to get different food sources for animals. There's going to be different opportunities for harvesting resources to help you in survival or just regular everyday life. And there are going to be major differences between what happens in each of these forests in each of the 4 seasons. So, a good example is like where I live. If I want to find a porcupine in winter, I always go to dense stands of eastern hemlock trees because it provides the best wintertime food and shelter. But in the summer, I tend to find them a lot more in mixed forests near open fields where they can, head out to eat clover and then climb up in trees to sleep without having to travel all that far. So just by tuning your focus on the different mixtures of forests that you encounter on your outings, it makes the process of finding cool things much more intuitive and instinctual, because very quickly you start to notice patterns. And noticing patterns leads you to have new insights about how everything is connecting on the land, which helps you to make the leap to a higher level of understanding, really see the big picture of your local plant life and wildlife, etc. Okay, now the second thing that I want to share with you here is something called age distribution. It's another fancy sounding term that, again, just means something very simple. So, this time when we look at the photo, what we're going to look at is how many different ages of trees are in these forests. And again, let's count them up, starting with the one on the left. And what you'll notice when you take a look is that most of the trees are about the same thickness. There aren't any that look like they're super aged grandfathers of the forest, and there aren't really too many younglings hanging around, which tells us that this forest is made up of trees that are almost universally about the same age. Isn't that interesting? Now, the photo on the right is a very different story. We got this big spruce tree towering over everything in the background with some full-size deciduous just behind it. We got baby maples and middle-aged birch trees, baby conifers. It's an intergenerational mishmash. And, this is important for 2 reasons. First, what you're seeing here is a very direct and explicit footprint of exactly what has happened on this land in the last 50 years, 100 years, even longer in many cases. In a natural, untouched forest, you will find old growth trees, young trees, middle-aged trees, all occupying the same relative space. So when you go into a forest and you see that the trees are all the same age, it means that something has interrupted the natural pattern of that forest. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that this place has been clear-cut or abused by humans. There are natural reasons why forests sometimes have to start over from scratch, such as fire or a hurricane blowing through. And in many environments, these disturbances play a very important ecological role, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But the point is that you now know how to recognize the pattern, which enables you to very easily track down the answer. Now, the second reason why age distribution is important is that once you know that you're dealing with an intergenerational forest or a forest where all the trees are the same age, this also tells you a lot about the plant life and the wildlife. Some animals require really well-developed multi-generational forests in order to survive. It's a really good indicator of forest health. And it's also like, if you're into survival, sometimes old growth trees provide the only dry place to tuck under a root ball during a storm. And, I once spent almost a week living under the dry root ball of a big hemlock tree. And if you're in a forest that's only like 30 years old, good luck finding a dry root ball, because the trees just aren't old enough to create that kind of shelter. So with just a little bit of practice, you can train your eyes to instantly hone in on the major age and developmental differences between different forests, and it'll inform your decision making about where to go, where to explore, where might have the most opportunities and interesting things to check out. Okay, now, I want to point out something else here. There's a third really big difference between these two forests, and it's the final thing that we're going to look for in our forest analysis framework. So, did you notice that the forest on the right has a big glaring gap in the canopy, while the one on the left is completely grown together? Now, this is a huge thing to look for whenever you go outside, because it has a huge effect on what grows in this forest and how fast it grows. Some forests that are really well developed or at particular stages in their development will have a canopy that's so completely closed, almost no light hits the ground. And then to contrast with that, on the edge of a forest, or a lot of times, when a tree dies or falls over in a storm, it opens up more light. So what we're actually seeing here is a really important piece of evidence that there's a very big difference between what happens on the edge of a forest versus what happens at the interior of a forest. And the closer that you are located to what we might call edge habitat, the greater diversity of plants, animals, and resources you're going to find. The deeper that you go into a completely unbroken forest, the more it will start to seem sometimes almost quiet and abandoned. Now, the truth is that it's probably not as quiet and abandoned as it seems. It's just that the resources are more spread out and the animals are more spread out too. So edge habitat comes in many different shapes and sizes. Sometimes it's very obvious, such as a big forest rubbing up against a big meadow. Obviously, this is an edge habitat. And if you were to do a plant and wildlife survey of the area where this photo is taken, you would almost certainly find the greatest abundance and diversity of plant life and wildlife right at that point where the forest meets the meadow. But edge habitat can also be found at the breaks in a forest canopy that let light shine through and create these explosions of diversity. So this is also a different kind of edge habitat. It's kind of like a little micro edge at the interior of a forest. Now, I want to show you something else that's really cool about edges. Here's an example from a completely different habitat. Now, this is a much drier habitat, and I just love this photo because it shows such a beautiful contrast between where the forest starts and the meadow ends. But I want you to notice, it doesn't really seem all that diverse. And looking at this forest, if we count the number of different species, every single tree in this photo is a coniferous tree. There's literally no deciduous trees. And notice how even on the very edge, that the base of these trees have absolutely nothing growing and filling the space. It's all just dead grass. And, if we were back in a wet habitat like this one, that open space would in very short order get completely filled with little deciduous shrubs and low-growing herbs. I mean, look how much more diversity there is in the photo on the left compared to the photo on the right. And yet in both cases, we're looking at the same kind of edge habitat. They're both forest meeting open meadow. So, why doesn't the arid landscape forest have the same kind of diversity on the edge? And the reason is because there's something different driving diversity in this landscape. And I will demonstrate that right here. So this is a photo taken from a different location on the exact same landscape. And look at all the diversity here. We're not really getting big tall trees anymore, but there's like 6 different kinds of shrubbery, plus all the different grasses and flowers and reeds. So what's the difference between these two locations? And the reason that this forest has so much more diversity is because what we're actually looking at is the edge habitat of a little gathering point for water. And in a dry climate, water is much more scarce than sunlight. So water is actually going to be the big driver of diversity. Now, I want to show you the big picture of how this all works in the landscape, this is so cool. You can see up on this hill, we have pine trees, and that's it. And as you follow the flow of gravity downward, we get new plants and shrubs coming in until you hit this collection site at the bottom where things explode with like 50 million different kinds of shrubs and trees all growing up in a closed canopy system. So land meets water is another very important kind of edge, and in many cases it will be more important than forest meets meadow. Here's a classic example of a wet climate water edge. The wetland habitat creates incredible opportunities for huge diversity that will benefit you if you're a tracker, if you're just trying to learn about nature and hone your knowledge of the outdoors, or if you're an avid harvester of resources for survival or lifestyle improvement. Awesome. So, really basic. We talked about 3 questions that you can ask yourself in order to learn about a forest. We got species distribution. How many different species am I seeing? Age distribution. How many different age trees am I seeing? And looking at edge habitat. Am I at the edge of a forest or at the interior of a forest? And just by looking around at your local environment and asking yourself these 3 questions, you'll start to become a lot more intuitive about knowing what's happening around you as you travel through different areas. You'll start to get a feel for, oh wait, this is the kind of landscape where I always find deer. Or, this is the kind of landscape where I might want to make my shelter because it's accessible to so many different resources. And, being tuned in to your surroundings at this level is a skill that will inform your decision making about whatever kind of outdoor experience you're looking for, because you start taking cues from the land itself. The land will actually give you all the information that you need. It's very, very cool. So at this point, you're watching this video and hearing me talk, and if what I've been sharing with you so far is exciting, then I want to invite you to get some information about an audio learning program that I created called Awaken Your Naturalist Intelligence. I'm a big fan of being able to learn by listening, and the whole goal of this program is that you can put on these recordings anytime you want and get incredibly valuable insights that build your ability to become tuned with the patterns of nature. So on this page, right below this video, you will see a link to where you can go check out the details of these recordings and just go see if it's a good fit for your goals. If you see yourself as someone who wants to be a better tracker, better naturalist, or just want to feel more confident with what's happening around you outside, you should definitely, at the very least, go see what it's all about. I'm going to share a whole bunch of really cool things for you to learn and practice that I think will really make a big difference for you. So go ahead and click that link. It will be well worth your time to have a read through that page. Go check it out, and thanks so much for tuning in and watching this presentation right to the very end. That is truly awesome, and I hope you have a really great day.